I never liked arriving late to anything, least of all family events. My entire life had been a strange dance with schedules, precision, and the need to be one step ahead. So when I stepped through the glass doors of the Grand Imperial Hotel, alone, I was exactly on time. The chandeliers above me shimmered like constellations frozen in glass, their light spilling onto polished marble floors where the shoes of guests clicked in a rhythm of wealth and vanity. It was Cassandra's engagement party, though to anyone walking in without context, it looked more like a royal wedding. Towers of champagne flutes glistened like crystal organs, flowers exploded in impossible shades of ivory and blush, and an army of waiters in black and white glided through the hall like synchronized performers. Everyone seemed rehearsed. Everyone except me. I had walked in without a date, without armor. Just me in a dress that was simple, black, and unapologetically mine. And in that moment, when I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turn to measure, to scan, to judge, I reminded myself why I came. Not for Cassandra, not for the family, but for me. There is a silence you hear before the whispers start. A pause in the air where you can almost sense the pivot, the way a room rearranges its focus to identify an intruder. That was me. The Boyd cousin who had left for Europe a decade ago, who hadn't attended birthdays or Christmas dinners, who built a life no one here fully understood. Is she still single? A voice hissed somewhere to my right, not even lowered to be polite. Unbelievable. Another answered, soft laughter following like wind chimes shaken by petty winds. I felt the corners of my lips curve into something not quite a smile. If I had learned anything in 34 years, it was that silence often speaks louder than any rebuttal. My heels clicked once, twice, 3 times across the marble, as I made my way further inside. The sight that greeted me at the center of the ballroom was Cassandra. My cousin, my shadow-turned star. Her dress was a river of sequins, catching the light in dangerous ways, her hair sculpted into waves that looked effortless but probably took a team of stylists an entire afternoon. Beside her stood Adrian, her fiancé, whose family owned more land in New England than some countries in Europe. Adrian was tall, perfectly groomed, his tuxedo molded to him like armor. His parents flanked him, both dripping with the type of old-money refinement that makes people straighten their posture without realizing it. I should have felt proud. That's what family events are for, right? To stand together, to celebrate one another. But instead, as Cassandra's gaze swept across the room and landed everywhere but on me, I felt the familiar sting of invisibility. "Miss Boyd," a waiter murmured with a practiced smile, offering me a tray of sparkling champagne. I shook my head, asked for water instead. Alcohol dulled edges, and tonight I needed mine sharp. I found a seat near the back, exactly where they expected me to be. Away from the curated photographs, away from the glossy display of Cassandra and Adrian's future empire. From here, I could see everything. The families mingling, alliances forming in clusters of laughter and nods, the photographers circling like vultures ready to immortalize perfection. I told myself I didn't care. And maybe I didn't, not in the way they thought. But there is a unique ache in being alien within your own bloodline, like standing in the house you grew up in and realizing every photo frame on the wall has your face missing. A cousin I barely remembered leaned across the table, her perfume sharp enough to sting. "You came alone?" she asked, head tilted as if observing an endangered species. "Yes." "Oh," she let the syllable dangle, then added, "I thought by now you'd have someone." I sipped my water. Someone would have been late. Her laugh was brittle, and she quickly turned back to her husband, who looked relieved the conversation was over. That was always the narrative, wasn't it? That a woman like me, busy, ambitious, unaccompanied, was somehow incomplete. They mistook solitude for failure. They mistook independence for emptiness. But I had built companies from scratch, navigated boardrooms where men twice my age underestimated me until they signed contracts worth millions. I had seen cities that these people only admired on postcards. And still, tonight in this ballroom of glittering chandeliers, none of it seemed to matter. Because here, I was not Harmony Boyd, the CEO. I was Harmony, the cousin without a ring. I adjusted my posture, the way I did before stepping onto a stage to present research, and let the murmur of conversations wash over me. That's when I noticed Adrian's uncle at the front table. His presence was different from the rest. While others glowed with the sheen of performance, he sat with a stillness that drew attention without effort. Alexander Sterling. I knew him. Not personally, not yet, but his name was inked across articles I had clipped for years. A man who didn't just inherit but expanded, who turned decaying ventures into empires. His hair was silver, his suit unassuming in its precision, but his aura was undeniable. A man who had been in enough rooms of power to command one without speaking. And for a fraction of a second, his gaze met mine. It wasn't a look of dismissal like the others. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. I blinked, unsure, and then the moment passed. He turned back to Adrian, listening with polite interest. A shiver traced my spine. Recognition was a dangerous thing. The moment passed, but it clung to me like static in the air. Recognition. I could not shake it. I had walked into this ballroom expecting nothing more than survival. I would sit through speeches, clap when required, smile when the camera lenses hovered too close, and then vanish before midnight. That was the plan. I never expected anyone here to see me, much less someone like Alexander Sterling. But perhaps I was imagining it. Perhaps that fleeting glance was nothing more than my mind's desperate attempt to construct meaning in a night designed to erase me. I shifted in my chair, straightened the hem of my dress, and reminded myself to breathe. On the stage, Cassandra and Adrian were being ushered forward by the MC, their hands entwined, their smiles flawless. They looked like the picture of perfection, the kind people pinned onto vision boards. Cassandra raised her glass, and the crowd hushed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty. "To love, to legacy, to family," she announced, her voice syrupy and trained. The applause was immediate, swelling like a wave. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and the orchestra swelled in agreement. I clapped too, though slower, the sound of my palms swallowed by the roar around me. As I sat there, a memory cut through the noise. I was 10 again, sitting in the back row of our school gymnasium. Cassandra was on stage, a tiara on her head, being crowned the Spring Festival princess. Parents cheered, teachers clapped, children squealed. I clapped too, my hands raw from the effort, until I realized my parents were watching me. "Smile," my mother had whispered, her fingers pressing against my arm. "Don't look jealous." I wasn't jealous. I had been in the library that morning, finishing a science project that would later win me a regional award. But no one remembered that. They remembered Cassandra in her tiara. That was the first time I learned the value of appearances. And the first time I realized my victories were invisible to the people who were supposed to care. Back in the ballroom, I sipped my water. The ache of that memory had dulled over the years, but it still lingered like a scar under the skin. A woman's voice snapped me out of it. "Isn't she stunning?" she whispered to her companion, her gaze fixed on Cassandra. "And so fortunate to marry into the Sterlings. Some women just have it all." Her companion smirked. Unlike her cousin. They didn't bother to lower their voices. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered patterns with my fingertip. There was a time when words like that would have sent me running to the restroom, locking the stall, willing myself not to cry. But tonight, the sting was different. Quieter, almost like background noise, because I knew something they didn't. I had lived through nights of code and research, through flights where my only luggage was a backpack stuffed with documents, through boardrooms where I was told my ideas were too ambitious. And still I built. Still I endured. Still I stood. These people would never know the taste of instant ramen eaten over a laptop at 3 a.m. They would never know the burn of rejection emails piling up like tombstones. They would never know the rush of watching something you created work for the first time. But I did. That was my wealth. Invisible to them, but carved into me like bone. Another memory surfaced, uninvited. I was 14, crouched on the floor of my room, wires spread out before me like veins. I had built a makeshift device that could time the heating cycle of our ancient oven. My father had found me at 2 a.m, bleary-eyed, annoyed. "Why can't you be normal, Harmony?" he had sighed. "Why can't you just go to sleep like other girls?" I remember staring at him, wanting to explain that my brain did not turn off the way others did. That when an idea came, it burned until I followed it through. But I stayed quiet, because in our family, quiet was easier. The orchestra played louder now, pulling me back into the present. I blinked, letting the memory fade. At the front table, Alexander Sterling leaned toward Adrian, listening intently. His hand rested on a glass of whiskey, untouched. His posture was calm, but his eyes, sharp, deliberate, swept across the room again. And for the second time that night, they paused on me. This time, it wasn't fleeting. I lowered my gaze, pretending to adjust the strap of my clutch. My pulse quickened, and not because of nerves. It was recognition again, but clearer, like a whisper turning into words. Did he know? No, impossible. My work was buried under contracts, non-disclosures, anonymous citations in journals read only by specialists. The projects I had built were faceless, their fingerprints erased by the companies that paid for them. I was a ghost in my own success. And yet, 3 years ago, I heard someone at the next table murmur, there was that biotech project, the one that saved MedNova. What was it called? The Adaptive Genome Recovery Model, the other answered, swirling her champagne. A genius breakthrough. Nobody knows who the lead architect was. They kept her name hidden. Pity, really. Her. The word sent a jolt through me. I looked down, hiding the curve of my lips before it betrayed me. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, because I knew. It was me. I have always believed that silence has its own gravity. In a room filled with music, chatter, and clinking glasses, silence can feel like a black hole, pulling your attention whether you want it or not. That night, as the engagement party swirled around me in glitter and gold, my silence weighed heavier than the chandeliers above. I sat near the edge of the banquet hall, invisible but not unseen. That paradox had followed me my entire life. People didn't invite me to join, but they always made sure to notice I was there. Cassandra was laughing now, her arm looped around Adrian's as photographers captured the perfect angle. Her laughter had always been rehearsed, though I doubted anyone else could hear the notes of performance in it. I always could. Do you remember? I heard one of Adrian's cousins whisper at the next table that Cassandra was chosen for that European debutante ball years ago. I thought it was such an honor. Harmony didn't even go, did she? Of course not, another replied. She was busy with some science camp, I think, always the odd one. The words should have bounced off me, but instead they found their way under my skin like splinters, because I remembered that summer. I was 17. Cassandra had been selected for the Vienna Rose Ball, a tradition of gowns and champagne where young women were paraded as proof of their family's elegance. My parents were ecstatic. They talked for weeks about dresses and etiquette lessons. I had been asked to help with her hair, her makeup, her rehearsal walks. The same week, I had received an invitation to present a paper at an international youth science forum. It wasn't glamorous. It was in a cramped auditorium in Brussels, filled with teenagers hunched over laptops. But it mattered to me. When I told my parents I wanted to go, my mother sighed. Do you really need to? Cassandra's event is more important for the family. I went anyway. I spent my savings on a plane ticket and a cheap hostel bed, and I stood on that stage in Brussels with trembling hands, explaining my research on adaptive neural coding. I didn't win. But a professor from Zurich approached me afterward, pressed his card into my palm, and said, "You think differently, don't lose that." I never told my family. It wouldn't have mattered. To them, I was simply absent. Back in the ballroom, I stared at the champagne tower, each glass stacked delicately on the one beneath it. One wrong move and the entire structure would collapse. Families are like that, I thought. Built on appearances, fragile in ways no one admits. Miss Boyd, I looked up. A waiter stood beside me with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. His expression was blank, professional, but there was something almost apologetic in his eyes. He didn't say the words, but I could feel them. You don't belong here, do you? I shook my head politely. He moved on. The truth was, I had debated not coming at all. My mother's voice still rang in my ear from the phone call 2 weeks earlier. Don't wear anything too corporate, Harmony. This isn't one of your conferences. It's a family event. Try to look softer. Softer. I had laughed, even though it wasn't funny. I wasn't made to be soft. I was made of restless nights and burning questions, of circuits and cells and data points that whispered truths only I could hear. But softness was what my family prized. Cassandra had mastered it from the moment she could walk in patent leather shoes and tilt her head just so. And me, I had been the hard edge, the wrong note in their perfect chord. The orchestra's music shifted, swelling into something grander. A spotlight swept across the room, landing squarely on Cassandra and Adrian. They were guided to the center, where a microphone waited. Thank you all for being here, Adrian began, his voice steady, trained like a politician. This night is not just about love. It is about families joining, traditions continuing, and futures being built together. Applause, nods, smiles, then Cassandra leaned in. And we are so grateful for each of you, friends, relatives, colleagues, who make this journey meaningful. Tonight is about unity, about belonging. Her eyes swept across the room, and for a split second they landed on me. But there was no warmth in her gaze, only calculation, a reminder you don't belong. I held her stare until she looked away. A voice at my table chuckled. She's always been the star, hasn't she? Poor Harmony, must be hard to live in that shadow. I turned my head slowly, meeting the speaker's eyes. Shadows only exist when there's light. I'm fine in the dark. He blinked, caught off guard, then forced a laugh. But the truth hung there, unshaken, because I had learned to build in the dark. Another memory surfaced, unbidden. I was 21 in the basement of a university lab, surrounded by half-broken equipment and a handful of equally stubborn students. We were working on a prototype for a new kind of biosensor. Nights bled into mornings, coffee into energy drinks. At one point, Cassandra had called me. She was planning her second wedding. "You should come back for the rehearsal dinner," she insisted. "I can't, I have deadlines." "You're always busy," she sighed. "It's like you don't care about family." Family, that word had been thrown at me like a weapon for years. Family meant showing up for them, even when they never showed up for me. Family meant shrinking myself so Cassandra could shine brighter. I had hung up without answering. And when our prototype finally worked, when it beeped to life in that dusty lab, I cried alone. Not because no one cared, but because I finally accepted that I couldn't make them. Back in the ballroom, I glanced toward the front table again. Alexander Sterling was leaning back now, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the weight of his presence. He didn't belong to the performance either. He was watching, measuring, cataloging. I wondered what he saw. Perhaps he recognized the same thing I did, that the champagne, the flowers, the orchestras, all of it was scaffolding around a hollow structure. Perhaps that was why his eyes lingered on me. But then the moment shifted. The MC announced a dance, and Cassandra floated into Adrian's arms, their movements smooth, rehearsed. The crowd sighed, enchanted. And I sat there, still. Because I knew something the rest of them didn't. I knew that sometimes, the most fragile structures are the ones that look most perfect. And I knew that tonight, perfection was about to crack. There is a strange kind of loneliness that comes when you are surrounded by noise. The ballroom was alive with music, chatter, laughter, the rhythm of polished shoes sliding across the dance floor. Yet at my table, silence pressed against me like a second skin. I watched Cassandra twirl in Adrian's arms, the two of them glowing under the chandeliers like something out of a magazine. Guests clapped in perfect rhythm, the orchestra swelled, and phones rose to capture every angle. It was a performance, carefully staged, each moment curated for applause. And I was part of the audience, though no one would ever admit it. A man I didn't recognize slid into the empty chair beside me. His cufflinks glimmered under the light, his cologne sharp and deliberate. He leaned close enough that I caught the chill in his tone. "You must be Harmony," he said. I turned, meeting his gaze. His eyes were the kind that calculated before they judged. "Yes," I answered evenly. He smiled without warmth. "I've heard about you. The cousin who chose career over family. Must be liberating." It wasn't a question, though I treated it as one. "It is." He chuckled, swirling his drink. "You know, people like you fascinate me. All that brilliance, all that ambition, and yet," he gestured toward the dance floor. "Here you are alone." I set my glass down carefully. "I'd rather be alone than misplaced." His smile faltered, and for a moment he seemed to search for a clever retort, but none came. He excused himself soon after, disappearing into the crowd. That was the pattern of the night. They came, they prodded, they left, unable to understand why my solitude didn't sting the way they expected. But it did sting, just not for the reasons they thought. It stung because even after all these years, I still wanted, deep down, for someone in my family to defend me. To step in, to remind these people that my worth wasn't defined by the empty seat beside me. But no one did, and maybe no one ever would. I glanced toward the front table again. Alexander Sterling was still there, his expression calm, his focus divided between Adrian, the speeches, and occasionally me. Each time his gaze lingered, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Not validation, not approval, recognition. Recognition is different. It doesn't come with applause or polite nods. It comes with the weight of someone truly seeing you. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne. I declined again, opting for water. Alcohol blurred lines, and tonight the lines mattered. From the stage, Adrian's father rose to give a speech. He spoke of legacy, of tradition, of the sterling name that Cassandra was now stepping into. The room hummed with reverence. As he spoke, I drifted into another memory. I was 25, standing in front of my parents' fireplace. Cassandra was there too, glowing in the aftermath of her second wedding. Guests had gone home, leaving only family behind. My father had poured himself a drink, my mother was adjusting Cassandra's necklace. And then she had looked at me. "When will it be your turn, Harmony?" I had swallowed the answer. Because how could I explain that my turn was happening elsewhere, on stages in Europe, in labs across Asia, in meetings where contracts worth millions balanced on my words? How could I explain that my life wasn't measured in bouquets or rings, but in prototypes and data sets and the thrill of discovery? I had said nothing, and my silence had been interpreted as guilt. That night returned to me now, layered over the image of Adrian's father proclaiming Cassandra's importance to the Sterling dynasty. The irony wasn't lost on me. They spoke of legacy, while I had been quietly building one the world would one day depend on. The applause roared again, jolting me back into the present. Glasses lifted, voices echoed with congratulations. I clapped too, but slower, each strike of my palm against the other carrying a rhythm only I could hear. It was then that Cassandra approached me. Her dress shimmered under the lights as she crossed the floor, her smile wide, her steps purposeful. To anyone watching, it looked like a gracious bride-to-be greeting her cousin, but I knew better. She stopped at my table, leaned down just enough so her earrings brushed against her cheek. "I just wanted to check in," she whispered. "Make sure you're comfortable." Her voice was coated in honey, but her eyes were sharp. "I'm fine," I replied. "You seem distant." I met her gaze steady. "Cassandra, we haven't had a real conversation in years. Don't act surprised." Her smile didn't falter, though it trembled at the edges. "Well, you're here now, that's what matters." She straightened, gave my shoulder a performative squeeze, and walked back to Adrian before anyone could question her absence. I watched her go, a hollow laugh rising in my chest. That's what matters. If only she knew, because what mattered wasn't me being here. What mattered was the story they wanted to tell. And I was supposed to play my role, the invisible cousin, the silent backdrop against which Cassandra's perfection could shine brighter. But I had grown tired of that role. At the table behind me, voices drifted again. "Pretty, but cold," one of Adrian's relatives muttered. "You can tell she's one of those women who marries her career. Probably expects us to applaud her for showing up alone," another chuckled. I closed my eyes for a moment. My coat was in the cloakroom. My car wasn't far. I could leave. I could disappear into the night, let them have their champagne and their carefully staged photographs. But something in me refused. I stayed seated, hands steady, gaze fixed forward, because I had survived boardrooms colder than this, because I had fought for patents harder than this, because I had faced rejections sharper than this. And because somewhere inside me, I knew the night was not done with me yet. At the front table, a chair scraped back, slow, purposeful. The sound cut through the music, through the laughter, through the clink of glass. The air shifted, subtle but undeniable. Conversations faltered, heads turned. Alexander Sterling was rising to his feet. The scrape of his chair was like a blade against glass. Sharp, unmistakable. The ballroom froze in its rhythm, and for the first time all night, every eye turned not toward Cassandra, not toward Adrian, but toward him, Alexander Sterling. He rose with a kind of quiet authority that didn't need announcing. His suit was tailored but not loud, his silver hair swept back, his expression calm yet absolute. He didn't adjust his cuffs or clear his throat. He didn't need to. The room gave him space before he even asked for it. I felt my chest tight. This was not part of the script. People whispered, trying to calculate his reason for standing. The orchestra stumbled, then silenced itself entirely. Cassandra paused mid-laugh, her hand still resting on Adrian's arm. Adrian looked confused, his eyes darting from his uncle to the crowd. And me? I sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, pretending my pulse wasn't drumming like war. Alexander's gaze swept the room once, deliberate, before it landed squarely on me. My stomach flipped, the air around me thickened. Then, without hesitation, he bowed. Not a polite nod, not a casual tilt of his head, a full, deliberate bow. The kind reserved for dignitaries, for people of rank, for those who demanded respect without words. The gasp rippled through the ballroom like wind through leaves. Forks clattered, someone dropped a glass, and I heard the faint click of a camera shutter capturing the moment. My throat tightened. He straightened, and the silence deepened. "Miss Boyd," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. "It is a privilege to finally meet you." Every head turned. My cousin's face stiffened into something dangerously close to fury. Adrian blinked rapidly as if his uncle had spoken in a foreign tongue. Adrian's mother, poised and polished, looked like she had swallowed lemon juice. I kept my face still. "Mr. Sterling," I replied softly, my voice refusing to tremble. "The privilege is mutual." A murmur swelled, then hushed just as quickly, everyone waiting for context. Alexander gave it to them. "Your keynote at the Zurich summit," he continued, "reshaped how our subsidiaries approached adaptive biotech integration. That model changed the trajectory of an entire division of Sterling Enterprises. And for that, I owe you more than a bow. I owe you gratitude." The whispers erupted again, louder, harsher, like a storm breaking through glass. Zurich. They remembered Zurich as a headline, a conference that had shifted the market. They remembered the project that had redirected billions. But none of them knew who had been behind it. Now they did. I could feel their eyes recalculating me, rewriting their judgment in real time. The invisible cousin, the ghost at the table. Suddenly, I wasn't either of those things. Cassandra's smile cracked. Zurich, she echoed, her voice too bright, too brittle. Alexander ignored her. His focus remained on me. Wanted to thank you in person. Your work was more than impressive, it was pivotal. I inhaled slowly, deliberately. Thank you, I said, though I suspect you give me more credit than I deserve. He shook his head, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. No, Miss Boyd, not enough perhaps, because brilliance rarely receives the credit it deserves when hidden behind anonymity. The ballroom was silent again. The weight of his words pressed against every surface. For a moment, I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was almost unbearable. For years, I had built in shadows, my contributions erased by corporations that branded themselves as saviors. And now, in this glittering hall of champagne and chandeliers, the truth surfaced. And it came not from my family, not from Cassandra, but from him. My mother's hand flew to her pearls. My father's brows knitted together as if trying to remember something I had once told him years ago and he hadn't listened. Cassandra looked like she wanted to scream. I didn't move, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Let them stew. Let them recalculate. Let them realize they had written the wrong story all along. Alexander didn't return to his seat immediately. Instead, he gestured to a waiter. A glass of water for Miss Boyd, he requested, his tone almost ceremonial. The waiter hurried, nearly tripping over himself to obey. When the glass was placed in front of me, Alexander raised his own, though it was still full. To innovation, he said, voice steady, and to those who build, not inherit. A hush swept the room again. No one dared move. I lifted my glass, clinked it gently against the silence, and drank. It tasted like victory. The silence after Alexander's toast felt heavier than any applause. The chandeliers above seemed to flicker, as if even the light itself wasn't sure how to behave. Then the murmurs started again, rippling through the crowd like sparks catching dry leaves. Zurich, that was her. No, impossible, was it really? I thought that work was done by some European team. A man at the next table leaned toward his wife. All this time, I thought she was just, the eccentric cousin. Their whispers slid across the air, reaching me with surgical precision. Cassandra's hand tightened on her champagne flute. Her knuckles whitened, but her smile didn't crack. Not yet. She was too well trained for that. She tilted her head toward Adrian, whispered something sharp enough to crease his brow. He nodded stiffly, though it was obvious he didn't know how to respond. Meanwhile, Adrian's mother, the matriarch polished to perfection, shifted in her seat. Her smile froze, her posture stiffened. She glanced at me once, then quickly away, as though my very existence was an inconvenience she wanted erased. I sipped my water, calm, steady, because I knew this wasn't just a bow. It was a correction. Alexander didn't return to his seat. He moved toward me, slow but certain, like a tide reclaiming shore. Every head followed his steps, the entire ballroom bending around his movement. When he reached my table, he extended a hand, not to shake but to gesture. "Would you join me for a walk?" The request was simple. The weight behind it was not. For a moment, I considered saying no, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Because leaving the room now would create another silence, another black hole of speculation. But then I saw Cassandra's face, her perfect smile trembling at the edges, her world beginning to fray. And I realized the power in walking away. I set my glass down, stood, and followed him. The ballroom erupted again, not with applause but with questions. Eyes tracked us as we slipped past the glittering tables, past the orchestra that faltered before finding its rhythm again, past the photographers who didn't dare raise their cameras. The terrace doors opened with a rush of night air. Cool, clean, honest. Out here, the noise dimmed. The stars above Manhattan blinked faintly, smothered by city light but still persistent. Alexander rested his hands in his coat pockets, exhaled slowly. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you." "I know." My voice was steady. "You were trying to correct the record." A smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. "Exactly." We stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the city filling the gaps. He looked at me with the same recognition as before, but deeper now, sharper. "You know," he began, "that model of yours, it didn't just save one division. It redirected the course of an entire sector. You must realize that." "I know what it did." I crossed my arms lightly. "But what I also know is that my name was never attached to it. That was by design. Corporations don't like the spotlight on individuals. They prefer the myth of the brand." He nodded slowly. "Yes, and yet myths crumble. Truth has a way of surfacing." "Usually too late," I said. He studied me. Tell me, Miss Boyd, does it bother you that your family never saw it, never understood the scale of what you've done? I hesitated. The question struck deeper than I wanted it to. It used to, I admitted. For years, I wanted their approval. I wanted my mother to brag about me the way she bragged about Cassandra's dresses. I wanted my father to ask about my work instead of asking if I had met someone yet. I wanted to matter. And now, I said slowly, I matter without them. He smiled faintly, approving. Good, because the people who need to understand already do. His words lingered, sharper than the night air. I turned my gaze toward the city skyline, the glowing towers stacked like ambitions against the sky. So why tell them tonight? Why break their illusion? Because illusions, he said simply, deserve to be broken. The door creaked open behind us. Cassandra stepped out, her dress glittering under the terrace lights. She carried her smile like a weapon, but her eyes betrayed her fury. There you are, she said, her voice too sweet. Uncle Alexander, we were just about to begin the toasts. Then begin without me, he replied evenly. Her smile tightened. She turned to me. Harmony, I didn't realize Zurich was you. Why didn't you ever tell us? I met her gaze, calm. You never asked. Her jaw clenched. That's not fair. No, I said softly, it's just true. The silence stretched between us like glass ready to shatter. She looked away first, her hand trembling on the railing. Alexander cleared his throat gently. Go back inside, Cassandra. Enjoy your evening. She hesitated, then spun on her heels, retreating into the warmth of the ballroom. When the door closed, the night felt cleaner. Alexander glanced at me. You have more strength than they deserve to witness. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Strength or stubbornness? Both, he said, and both are valuable. We stood in silence again, the city humming below us, the weight of the ballroom still pressing behind the glass doors. Tell me something, he said finally. Do you want to keep building in shadows, or are you ready to step into light? I didn't answer right away, because for the first time in a very long time, I realized I had a choice. When I stepped back into the ballroom, the air shifted again. I could feel it immediately, like walking into a room where someone has just smashed a glass and everyone is pretending they don't see the shards. The orchestra had resumed, but their rhythm felt off, hurried. Guests tried to laugh, to sip champagne, to continue conversations, but every glance darted toward me, toward the door I had just come through. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was something else now, something they didn't know how to categorize. I made my way to my table slowly, deliberately. Eyes followed me, whispers flared, then softened when I turned my head. My pulse was steady, my stride even. I wasn't going to rush, not tonight. Cassandra stood near the front, still surrounded by Adrian's family, her smile stretched thin, her hand clamped tightly around her flute of champagne. She was losing grip on her performance, and everyone could see it. I sat down. The cushion beneath me sank with a sigh, like it too understood the weight of the moment. The next speech began, this time from one of Adrian's uncles. He rambled through anecdotes about family, about tradition, about Cassandra being a perfect addition to their dynasty. The words floated above me, meaningless, until he made the mistake of glancing in my direction. And of course, he said, raising his glass, we welcome every member of the Boyd family, even those who prefer the laboratory to the ballroom. Laughter flickered through the crowd. Polite, rehearsed, cutting. I held my glass, my hand steady. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to, because Alexander was already rising again. His voice cut through the chuckles like a blade. It takes very little talent to inherit wealth. It takes even less to marry into it. But the woman sitting beside me tonight has done neither. She has created value where there was none. She has earned respect in rooms most of you will never be invited into. So if we are raising glasses, mine is to her. Silence. And this time, no one dared laugh. I didn't smile. I didn't look around. I simply raised my glass, met his, and drank. The weight of his words didn't just crush the room, it cracked something in Cassandra. I saw it in the way her lips pressed tight, in the way her eyes gleamed with something sharp and wet. She set her glass down too hard, the stem clinking against the table, and began to walk toward me. Her heels struck the marble with sharp clicks, each one echoing louder than the last. The crowd parted as she approached, some curious, some wary. She stopped at my table, leaning slightly forward so her earrings swung like pendulums. Why? She hissed, her smile frozen for the audience. Why couldn't you let me have this night? I tilted my head calm. All I did was exist. Her nostrils flared. No, you had to be recognized. You had to take the spotlight. You couldn't just sit quietly for once. I set my glass down, my gaze steady. Cassandra, you've had a lifetime of spotlights. One evening with a shadow of mine won't kill you. The sharp intake of breath from the crowd around us told me they heard. All of them. Her voice cracked just enough to break through her performance. "You always made me feel like I wasn't enough." The irony of it nearly made me laugh. "Funny," I said softly, "because you and the rest of the family spent years making me feel like I was too much." The silence that followed was suffocating. Every guest, every relative, every photographer froze, their eyes darting between us like a tennis match. Adrian shifted uncomfortably near the stage. His mother looked horrified. My parents sat still, their faces masks of politeness, but their eyes betraying panic. Cassandra's hand trembled on the back of the chair beside me. Her perfect mask was slipping, and there was no fixing it now. "You couldn't let me have one day," she whispered, her voice raw despite the smile she forced for the cameras. "One day?" I asked. "Cassandra, you've had every day. Every compliment, every indulgence, every ounce of approval this family could give. All I've done is survive in the space you left behind." Her jaw tightened. "You're cruel." "No," I said, my voice low, calm. "I'm honest, something you've never had to be." The orchestra faltered again, unsure whether to continue. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. For the first time all evening, Cassandra's performance cracked wide enough for everyone to see the fracture lines beneath. She turned sharply, her heels clattering against the marble, her sequined dress catching the light like shattered glass. She disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by whispers. I sat back in my chair, my breath steady. The silence lingered for a beat, then the toasts resumed, though weaker, forced. The illusion was broken, and no amount of champagne could glue it back together. Beside me, Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You handled that well." "I wasn't trying to handle it," I replied. "I was just done pretending." He smiled faintly, approving. "Good." I glanced toward the stage, where Cassandra had reappeared beside Adrian, her smile pasted back on but her eyes burning. For once, the audience wasn't only admiring her. They were watching me too, measuring, recalculating. And for the first time all night, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the truth. The music tried to mend the atmosphere, but it was too late. The crack in Cassandra's facade had already spread through the room like a fracture in glass. Guests whispered into their champagne flutes, eyes darting between me and the glittering figure of my cousin, as if comparing the shine of two metals to see which one was real. I sat still, letting the weight of silence hang where words would have been wasted. My mother finally moved, rising from her seat with the careful steps of someone testing ice. She approached me slowly, her hand brushing her necklace, her lips drawn into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "You look beautiful tonight," she said softly, almost rehearsed. "Thank you," I replied, my voice level. She hesitated, then leaned closer. We didn't know about Zurich, about Mr. Sterling. You should have told us." I met her gaze, steady. "I did tell you, you just weren't listening." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She placed a hand over mine, squeezing as if touch could replace decades of silence. For a second, I let it remain there, warm, trembling, then I slid my hand away. "Why now?" I asked. She blinked. "What do you mean? Why are you proud now, Mother? Because someone powerful said I mattered, or because you finally believe it yourself?" Her throat worked, but no answer came. She only nodded stiffly and returned to her seat, her posture collapsing under the weight of truth. From across the hall, my father avoided my eyes. His hand gripped his glass too tightly, as if the stem could anchor him to a narrative that no longer existed. Cassandra reappeared at the stage, her cheeks flushed beneath the glitter of makeup, her smile stretched so tight it might snap. Adrian hovered beside her, his hand placed awkwardly at her waist. They looked like a photograph already faded. She took the microphone, her voice sharper than it had been all evening. "Family," she declared, forcing brightness. "Family is what tonight is about. No matter what distractions may arise, nothing is more important than unity." Her gaze flicked to me on the word distractions. The crowd chuckled weakly, but the illusion didn't hold. They had already seen behind the curtain. The next toast came from Adrian's father. He spoke of legacies, of marriages that build dynasties, of futures sculpted by tradition. His words droned like static until he made the mistake of glancing in my direction. "And of course," he said with a wry smile, "to those family members who have joined us tonight, even the ones who prefer the boardroom to the ballroom." This time, the chuckles were louder. I kept my face neutral, but Alexander set down his drink and rose again. His voice cut through the noise. "It takes very little skill to inherit wealth. It takes even less to marry into it. But to create value where none existed, to shape the future rather than cling to the past, that is worth honoring." And that is what Miss Boyd has done. The silence that followed was absolute. He lifted his glass. "So if we raise a toast tonight, mine is to her." Dozens of eyes snapped toward me, some softened, some narrowed. Cassandra's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut, her hand gripping Adrian's so tightly his knuckles turned white. I didn't smile. I didn't bow my head. I simply touched my glass to my lips, letting the silence work in my favor, because there is something more powerful than being praised. It is being understood. And in that moment, I realized that someone in this room finally saw me, not as a shadow, not as an inconvenience, but as I truly was. Cassandra couldn't hold it anymore. She dropped her smile entirely as she strode toward me once more, this time her voice sharper, her words louder, carrying across the tables. "You couldn't stand it, could you? You couldn't let me have one night without making it about you?" Gasps erupted. Cameras turned, lenses hungry for drama. I met her fury with calm. "Cassandra, I didn't make this about me, he did." I tilted my head toward Alexander. "You've always needed to prove something," she spat. "Always so desperate to show you're better than me." I leaned back in my chair. "If I had wanted to prove that, Cassandra, I would have done it years ago. I don't need to compete with you. I never did." Her breath hitched. Her anger wavered for a fraction of a second, revealing something raw beneath: fear. "You always made me feel like I wasn't enough," she whispered, barely audible. "And you," I replied, "always made me feel like I was too much." The words settled like stones in the air, heavy, unshakable. She turned abruptly, her dress glittering under the lights as she stormed away. Adrian followed, his expression pale and strained. The ballroom buzzed again, alive with whispers and speculation. The photographers exchanged frantic glances, unsure where to point their lenses now. I sat still, my hands folded on the table, my heart calm. For the first time all night, I didn't feel like a ghost in the background of someone else's story. I felt like the story. The ballroom tried to patch itself back together, but the seams were visible. Music resumed, laughter restarted, glasses clinked again, but it all felt brittle, forced, like a porcelain vase glued after shattering. The illusion was gone. I stayed at my table, letting the waves of sound move around me. People stole glances, some curious, some cautious, some newly respectful. A few nodded politely, the same people who hours ago would not have remembered my name. It would have been flattering if it weren't so predictable. Cassandra had vanished with Adrian, swallowed into some hidden room to repair her mask. My parents sat stiffly near the front, their smiles fragile, their eyes darting toward me and away again. For once, they didn't know what role to assign me. That disorientation was almost satisfying. Alexander remained nearby, unhurried, sipping his whiskey as though the night was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. His calm unnerved people. It reassured me. Eventually, he leaned toward me, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Would you like some air? This room feels saturated." I nodded. We slipped out together, this time without the weight of every gaze. Guests pretended not to notice, but I saw the flicker of curiosity in their eyes, the quick exchange of whispers. Let them speculate. The terrace welcomed us with cool night air. The city stretched before us, lights glittering across the skyline, cars streaming below like veins of fire. The hum of Manhattan was steady, indifferent to the drama inside the ballroom. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was easier here. Out here, silence wasn't judgment. It was clarity. Finally, Alexander broke it. "I meant what I said inside. That toast was not a courtesy. It was truth." I leaned against the railing, my fingers brushing the cold metal. "Truth is expensive. Most people can't afford it." A faint smile curved his lips. "And yet you've been paying that cost your entire life, haven't you?" I exhaled, half a laugh, half a sigh. Maybe I've just never learned how to lie convincingly." He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady. "Tell me, Harmony, do you regret it? The path you chose?" I turned my eyes toward the skyline. "Regret is a luxury." I didn't have time for it. I was too busy building. Too busy proving, at first to them and then to myself, that I could create something that lasted. "And you have," he said. The words landed heavier than I expected. I had heard praise before, investors impressed by numbers, colleagues admiring breakthroughs, but this was different. This was recognition without agenda. "I never asked them for applause," I admitted softly. "I just wanted them to see me. To acknowledge that I existed, that what I was doing mattered. But they were too busy watching Cassandra shine, and somewhere along the way I stopped asking." He nodded slowly. "And that is why you are stronger than them." I looked at him then, searching his face. "Why me? You could have left me invisible. It would have been easier for everyone." "Because illusions deserve to be broken," he said again, simply. "And because talent like yours does not belong in the shadows. It belongs where it can change things." I tilted my head, curious. "Change what exactly?" "Everything," he said. He slipped a hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. It looked worn, used, pages thick with notes. He flipped it open and tapped a line with his finger. I'm building something new, an initiative. It requires more than money, it requires vision. The kind that can rebuild from nothing. And I don't want just anyone beside me. I want you. The night air seemed to thicken around us. I stared at him, my chest tightening. A younger version of myself would have leapt at the offer without hesitation, hungry for validation. But now it felt different. What makes you think I'd say yes? I asked. He smiled faintly. Because you've never belonged in the background, and because you already know your place is in the rooms where the future is being shaped, not the ones where champagne towers are worshipped. I laughed softly, shaking my head. You're persuasive. I'm honest, he corrected. We stood in silence again, the hum of the city filling the space between us. I felt the weight of choice pressing against me. For years, I had carved my path out of sheer defiance, proving myself against the silence of family indifference. But this wasn't about defiance. This was about direction. I finally said, maybe we should talk Monday. His smile deepened, not triumphant, but satisfied. Monday, then? We didn't shake hands. We didn't seal it with anything more than mutual respect. And that was enough. Behind us, the muffled sound of music carried through the glass doors. Inside, they were still dancing, still pretending, still clinging to illusions. Out here, the night felt honest. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting for applause. I was waiting for possibility. When I re-entered the ballroom, the air hit me like perfume gone sour. The music was back, louder than before, almost desperate. Guests swayed on the dance floor, photographers snapped as though nothing had happened, but the undercurrent was undeniable. The story of the evening had already changed, and no orchestra could drown it out. I slipped back into my chair, aware of the eyes still trailing me. Some carried curiosity, others envy, a few something like respect. My cousin's seat at the head table was empty. She was still gone, repairing the cracks in her porcelain mask. Adrian stood stiffly beside his parents, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. My father approached first. He moved slowly, his glass still in his hand, his tie loosened just slightly. When he reached my table, he cleared his throat in that way men do when words don't come easily. "You've done well, Harmony," he said. His voice carried the weight of an apology, though the words themselves fell short. We didn't realize not the full extent. I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "You never asked." He winced, his eyes darting away. "It was intentional, we just thought that I'd outgrow it," I supplied. His silence was answer enough. I leaned back in my chair. "You don't have to explain. I stopped waiting a long time ago." Before he could answer, my mother appeared. She slipped beside him, her smile stretched, her pearls trembling lightly against her collarbone. "We're proud of you," she said softly. "Truly, tonight, seeing all this, it makes us proud." I met her gaze. "Why tonight?" "Because someone powerful said my name?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She reached for my hand, but I drew it back before she could touch. "Pride given out of embarrassment isn't pride," I said gently. "It's convenience." Her face crumpled just for a second before she forced the smile back into place. They both retreated slowly, returning to their table, their bodies stiffer than when they had arrived. And then Cassandra returned. The crowd hushed almost instinctively as she entered. Her dress shimmered under the chandeliers, her hair perfect again, her lipstick retouched, but her eyes betrayed her. They were sharp, red-rimmed, her fury only barely hidden under a brittle layer of poise. She walked straight to me. The crowd parted once more, anticipating spectacle. Cameras tilted. Conversations paused. She stopped in front of me, her smile frozen, her voice low but audible enough for the closest tables to hear. "I didn't know he knew you," she said. "Uncle Alexander." I had no idea. "You never asked," I replied, her lips pressed together. "That's not fair." "No," I said, "it's accurate." She inhaled sharply, fighting for control. "You always made me feel like I wasn't enough, Harmony. Always so much smarter, so much colder, so much beyond reach. Do you know what that feels like?" I tilted my head. "Yes, because you and my parents made me feel like I was too much. Too driven, too ambitious, too alone." Her mask cracked, her voice trembling. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said softly. "I've never needed to be better than you, I just needed to be me." The words hung in the air, raw and undeniable. The nearest guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between sympathy and shock. Cassandra's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. She turned abruptly, her heels clicking too quickly against the marble, vanishing once more into the crowd. I exhaled slowly, steady. For the first time in years, I felt the weight lifting, not because she had admitted her jealousy, not because the room finally saw me, but because I no longer needed their validation. The evening stretched on. Music resumed, toasts droned, conversations sputtered. But the rhythm of the night had shifted. I could feel it. They could too. Later, as the party thinned and guests began to leave, I found myself outside again, standing beneath the awning while the city air swept against my skin. Cars pulled up for valet, voices echoed faintly, laughter spilled into the night. Alexander joined me once more, his hands in his coat pockets, his tie slightly loosened. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The silence between us was comfortable, honest. Finally, he said, "You held your ground well." "I wasn't holding it for them," I replied. "I was holding it for me." He smiled faintly. "Good, because they will forget, but you won't." I looked at him, then at the city beyond. The skyline glittered, alive, indifferent. "Monday," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Monday." And with that, he stepped into the night. I stayed a moment longer, breathing in the cool air, feeling it fill my lungs. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for family to see me. I wasn't waiting for applause. I was waiting for what came next. The ballroom had begun to thin out. The orchestra played softer now, the violins stretching into tired notes. Waiters cleared half-empty glasses and scattered napkins monogrammed with Cassandra and Adrian's initials. The performance was nearly over, but the fractures remained visible, like cracks running through marble. I stayed by the terrace doors, content to observe. The glittering world they had built for Cassandra flickered under the weight of whispers. Guests drifted toward the exits, some too polite to speak, others too eager to gossip once outside. The story of the night was already being rewritten, and for once I wasn't a footnote. My mother approached again, slower this time. She held her clutch like a shield, her steps hesitant. When she reached me, she didn't smile. She looked smaller. "We didn't know," she said quietly. Her voice trembled as though admitting ignorance was heavier than pride. "About Zurich, about what you've built, we should have asked, we should have," I cut her gently. "You should have cared." Her lips parted, her eyes glistening. She reached out, fingers brushing the air between us, but stopped short. "We are proud of you, Harmony, truly." I studied her. "Why now? Why not when I was 14, building things in my room at night while Cassandra rehearsed for pageants? Why not when I was 21, begging you to understand why I missed her rehearsal dinner because I was presenting in Brussels? Why not when I was 28, calling from Berlin to tell you my company had landed its first big contract, and you changed the subject to Cassandra's honeymoon?" Her face crumpled. She looked older in that moment, weighed down by the ghosts of years she couldn't rewrite. "We didn't know how to connect with you. You were always different." "Different wasn't the problem," I said softly. "Indifference was." A silence stretched, sharp and raw. She blinked rapidly, then whispered, "I don't know how to fix it." "You don't," I replied. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be acknowledged." Her hand finally dropped to her side, defeated. She nodded once and stepped back, retreating toward my father, who lingered nearby with a glass too full for this hour. It was then Cassandra appeared. She moved through the thinning crowd like a storm barely held together. Her dress glittered still, her hair immaculate, but her eyes burned with exhaustion and something dangerously close to desperation. Adrian trailed behind her, looking more like a shadow than a fiancé. She stopped in front of me, her voice sharper than before, Rower. "You never wanted me to be happy, did you?" I blinked. "That's not true." "You couldn't let me have this night," she continued, her voice rising. "You couldn't stand that it was about me. It's always been about you, hasn't it? Your projects, your ideas, your brilliance. And what about me, Harmony? What about the one who was loved for being beautiful but never respected for anything else?" The words cracked through her mask like lightning. For the first time, she wasn't the perfect bride-to-be. She was just Cassandra, raw, jealous, aching. I held her gaze steady. "You think I took something from you tonight? Cassandra, I've been surviving in the spaces you left me. I didn't steal your spotlight. I built my own." Her breath hitched. "You always made me feel small. And you always made me feel like I was too much," I said softly. She flinched as though the words were physical. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us pulsed with years of unspoken truths, of childhoods that had diverged like broken branches. Finally, I said, "I didn't come here to take your night. I came here because despite everything, your family, but I can't keep apologizing for existing." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. She turned abruptly, her heels striking the marble as she disappeared again, Adrian following helplessly. I stayed by the terrace doors, the cool air leaking through the cracks. My chest felt both lighter and heavier at once, because the truth had finally been spoken, but it had come too late to heal anything. From the corner of my eye, I saw Alexander watching from his table. He didn't intervene. He didn't need to. He knew, as I did, that some illusions aren't shattered to destroy. They're shattered to reveal what was always there. I exhaled slowly. For years, I had carried the weight of wanting my family to see me, to understand me. Tonight, I realized I no longer needed them to. I knew the night had already shifted, but what happened next would determine how it ended. Not for Cassandra, not for the Sterlings, not even for my parents, but for me. The ballroom had become a theater of whispers, a place where chandeliers glittered too brightly, as if they were trying to disguise the fracture lines now spreading across the perfect stage. I sat at my table, calm, deliberate, watching the cracks widen. For once, I wasn't the one being measured. They were. A cousin I barely remembered walked past and gave me a nod, the kind of nod people reserve for someone they never noticed until others told them to. Respect born of second-hand approval. It meant nothing. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip. My reflection shimmered in the surface. Not a ghost anymore, not invisible, just present. That was enough. Across the room, Cassandra had retreated into some hidden corner, no doubt repairing her mask with Adrian's help. My parents were stiff in their seats, their postures brittle, their smiles strained. I could almost hear their thoughts, how to explain this shift to their friends, how to rewrite the family story without admitting the years they had spent ignoring me. For the first time, I didn't care. My father approached again, hesitating near my table. His glass was still in his hand, though I doubted he remembered what was in it. "You've done well, Harmony," he repeated, his voice low, as if saying it softly would make it more true. I met his eyes and held them steady. "You've said that already." He blinked, startled. "And it still doesn't answer the question," I continued. "Why only now?" He opened his mouth, but no words came, just a silence heavy enough to collapse under its own weight. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with a quiet scrape. The sound was nothing compared to Alexander Sterling's earlier gesture, but it felt like my own kind of declaration. "I think I'll take my leave," I said. A ripple passed through the room. People turned their heads, sensing the shift in the air again. Cassandra's absence had already unsettled them. My departure would seal it. I moved with steady steps toward the exit. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't fleeing, I was choosing. And there's a power in choosing. When I passed my mother's table, she reached out, her manicured hand brushing against my sleeve. "Harmony, wait," she whispered. I stopped, but I didn't sit. Her eyes glistened with something I wanted to call sincerity, though it arrived decades too late. "We're proud of you," she said again. I leaned closer so only she could hear. "Then be proud because it's true, not because someone else gave you permission." Her lips parted, her pearls trembling against her collarbone, but I didn't give her time to answer. I straightened and continued walking. The heavy doors opened to the terrace again, spilling me into the night. The air was cooler now, sharper, alive with the hum of Manhattan. The skyline stretched before me, towers lit like constellations built from steel and glass. Out here, everything felt more honest. No chandeliers, no orchestrated smiles, just the pulse of a city that had no interest in illusions. I drew a deep breath, the cold sliding into my lungs like clarity. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the noise of the ballroom fade into a muffled hum behind the glass. And then, footsteps. Alexander Sterling joined me, his coat draped loosely around his shoulders, his tie loosened as if the performance inside had drained even him. He didn't speak at first, and neither did I. The silence between us was cleaner than any toast. Finally, he said, "I was wondering if you would leave." I glanced at him. "Not leave, choose." A faint smile curved his lips. "Good, because there's a difference." We stood shoulder to shoulder, both looking out at the city. "You know," he continued, "you didn't have to respond to any of them tonight. Not to Cassandra, not to your parents. You could have stayed silent." "I've been silent my whole life," I said. Silence was survival. Tonight wasn't about survival. What was it about then? "Recognition," I answered, then corrected myself. "Not theirs, mine." He studied me with that measured gaze, the kind that weighed without judgment. "So what happens now?" I turned my eyes back to the skyline. "Now, I go on, I keep building, not because they finally noticed, but because I never needed them to." His nod was slow, deliberate. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you. People who build without applause, they're the ones who change everything." I tilted my head. "And what exactly are you asking me to change?" "Not asking," he said. "Inviting." He reached into his pocket, pulled out that worn leather notebook again, flipping to a page marked with a folded corner. "I'm starting something, a project that will require more than capital. It will require vision, resilience, the kind of grit that isn't taught but earned. I can think of no one better than you." The offer hung between us, heavy but not suffocating. I thought of the girl I had been, 14, wiring circuits in secret at 2 a.m., 17, spending her savings on a trip to Brussels for a conference no one cared about, 25, crying alone in a lab when a prototype finally worked. That girl would have begged for this moment. This woman didn't need to. "Let's talk Monday," I said, my voice even. His smile deepened, quiet and satisfied. "Monday it is." We didn't shake hands. We didn't seal it with anything but silence and the city lights. That was enough. When I turned back toward the ballroom, the glass doors glowed with artificial light, music spilling faintly through the cracks. I saw blurred silhouettes still dancing, still clinging to an illusion that had already cracked beyond repair. For the first time, I felt no pull to re-enter. I descended the marble steps, each one echoing softly in the night. The valet hurried forward, but I waved him off. I wanted to walk. To feel the pavement under my heels, the chill of the wind against my face. To remind myself that I was moving forward, not waiting behind. The streets of Manhattan opened wide before me. Cars rushed past, horns blared, neon signs flickered. It was imperfect, chaotic, alive, and I belonged to it far more than I ever had to the ballroom. I pulled my coat tighter, inhaling the crisp air. Somewhere behind me, music and laughter tried to stitch themselves back together, but they were just noise now. Out here, I was Cassandra's cousin. I wasn't my parents' disappointment. I wasn't the invisible guest. I was Harmony Boyd, and I was walking into my own story. The night had swallowed me whole, but it did not feel heavy. It felt like release. I walked without a clear destination, my heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythm that matched the restless pulse of the city. Manhattan was alive in the way the ballroom had pretended to be. Neon signs buzzed, taxis honked impatiently, and a street musician strummed his guitar with more soul than any string quartet inside that hotel could ever muster. I kept walking. Past the glittering storefronts, past groups of strangers laughing too loudly, past the shadows that stretched long and unashamed across the concrete. Every step pulled me farther from the suffocating air of chandeliers and champagne flutes. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the towers around me. As I passed a quiet cafe tucked between two office buildings, an older woman sitting outside looked up from her cup of tea. She wore a simple coat, her silver hair pulled back neatly. There was something steady in her gaze, something that made me slow down. "You were at the Sterling party," she said softly, almost as if it was a fact she didn't need confirmed. I blinked, caught off guard. "You recognized me?" she smiled. "I recognize people who don't belong to the room they're in. I was one of them once." Her voice carried no judgment, only understanding. She gestured to the chair across from her. Against my usual instinct to keep moving, I sat. She didn't ask for my story, and I didn't spill it. Instead, we shared a silence that felt like a pause in the chaos, a reminder that not every gaze needed to dissect or measure. Before I left, she placed her hand gently over mine. "Don't let them tell you when to shine. You already are." I walked away with those words tucked in my pocket like a secret compass. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had stretched out the tension in my body. My building was nothing impressive, no marble floors, no doormen in pressed uniforms. But when I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I breathed easier. Books lined the shelves in mismatched order, their spines bent from years of use. My desk was crowded with notebooks filled with sketches of ideas I hadn't yet tested. A whiteboard leaned against the wall, covered in equations that only I could decipher. This was my cathedral, my mess, my truth. I dropped my coat over the back of the chair and opened my laptop. Sterling's email was still there, glowing like a lighthouse on the dark screen. "Harmony," it read. I meant every word. "Let's discuss further. Monday, my office." I stared at the blinking cursor in the reply box. My fingers began to type. "Thank you for the offer. I would love to." I stopped. Deleted. Typed again. "I appreciate your recognition, but I need time to think." Deleted again. The truth was, I wasn't afraid of his offer. I was afraid of accepting it for the wrong reasons, afraid of letting it become another performance for the family who had only just begun to pretend they saw me. I closed the laptop without sending anything. Not tonight. Instead, I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The city stretched below, cars weaving like streams of light, buildings glowing like stubborn stars. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass. Memories pressed in. Being 12 and overhearing my aunt say I'd never catch up to Cassandra's charm. Being 20 and watching my parents beam with pride as Cassandra showed off her engagement ring while I stood invisible at the edge. Being 34 and still carrying those echoes like weights in my chest. But tonight, those echoes sounded faint. For once, they weren't the loudest voice in the room. I whispered to the glass, to the city, to myself. "I am not theirs to define." The words surprised me, but they felt truer than anything I had said inside the Sterling ballroom. I stayed at the window until my reflection blended with the skyline, until the night no longer felt like an enemy but a companion. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me toward bed. As I lay in the dark, the city's heartbeat pulsing faintly through the walls, I realized something simple but profound. The real stage had never been inside that glittering ballroom. It had always been here, inside the choices I made when no one was watching, and tomorrow I would make them again. The morning arrived quietly, with sunlight spilling across my apartment floor like a cautious guest. I woke without the usual heaviness in my chest. The city outside was already restless, horns, footsteps, the occasional shout, but inside I felt calm. I brewed coffee and carried the cup to my desk. My laptop still sat where I had left it, Sterling's email waiting like an unopened door. But before I touched it, my phone buzzed, Cassandra. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then I remembered her face last night, painted with fury and fear, and I answered. Her voice was sharper than the static on the line. You just had to take it, didn't you? The spotlight, the one night that was supposed to be mine. I let her words fall without rushing to catch them. I didn't take anything from you, Cassandra. I only stood where I already was. You embarrass me, she hissed. You made me look small. I closed my eyes, leaning against the desk. I didn't make you small. Your fear did. You've spent your life building stages so people would clap. I've spent mine building things that last, even when no one is watching. Silence, then a crack in her tone I had never heard before. Do you know what it's like, Harmony, to always wonder when you'll be replaced? To know the only thing you have is how you look, how people admire you, until the moment they do. For the first time, I didn't feel anger toward her. I felt pity. You were never my competition, I said softly. You were fighting shadows that were never mine to hold. The line stayed quiet. Then she whispered, almost too low to hear, I wish I could be like you. The call ended before I could reply. I set the phone down gently. No closure, but maybe not everything needed closing. Later that afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was careful, fragile, as if each word might shatter. Harmony, about last night, I know I wasn't fair to you, not for years. I didn't rush to fill the silence. She had always filled it for me, with criticism, with comparisons, with sighs of disappointment. Now it was her turn to sit in it. Finally, she continued, I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want you to know I see you now. I stared out the window, the city moving like a tide below. Maybe you do, I said, but I'm not living for your sight anymore. She began to cry softly. For once, I didn't try to comfort her. I simply let the truth hang there. When the call ended, I felt neither triumph nor regret, just release. Evening settled with a gray sky and the promise of rain. I reopened my laptop. Sterling's email glowed again, patient and steady. This time, I began typing without hesitation. Alexander, thank you for the conversation. Let's meet Monday. I'm ready to discuss where this could lead. I didn't delete it. I didn't rewrite it. I pressed send. The moment the message disappeared into the ether, I felt something shift. Not validation, not victory, freedom. I walked back to the window. The city lights were beginning to flicker alive, reflections shimmering across the wet streets. Somewhere out there, Cassandra was probably rehearsing another smile, my parents were probably rewriting their version of last night, and the guests were retelling the story with new exaggerations. None of it mattered, because for the first time, I wasn't trapped in their script. I was writing my own. I poured another cup of coffee even though it was late, the bitter taste grounding me. I sat at my desk and pulled a notebook closer, flipping past pages of equations and sketches until I found a blank one. Across the top, I wrote, Project Boyd. I smiled at the words, not for anyone else, just for me. When midnight came, I didn't feel tired. I felt alive. I pressed my palms against the cool glass of the window and whispered to the city below. I am not waiting anymore. The traffic roared back as if the city itself had answered. And with that, the story I thought I had been trapped in all my life dissolved into something else, not an ending, but a beginning. I turned off the lights, leaving the city to illuminate my room. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, steady, unafraid. I was Harmony Boyd, and this was only the start.